Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep Book Talks. I'm your co host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. So excited today to welcome Sir Ian Kershaw, the author of so many books, a decorated historian. How many accolades can I give you, Sir Ian? But today we are here to talk with our audience about your latest book, Personality and Power, Builders and Destroyers of Modern Europe, which, as you see, I have many questions for you. But I think what an important time to discuss this book, your book. What an important look at where we are coming from as we head into new elections, new leaders, and what these leaders, maybe we should all send them this book so that they can learn from what happened in the past and take it into the future. But for the United States, we just are coming out of an election. We are coming out of an announcement by someone who you mentioned in your book of a third presidential run. And I am just rereading my notes on this book thinking, wow, what an important time to have this discussion of personality and power and a look at how leaders shape history. What a moment. Thank you so much for joining us. To our audience, thank you for joining us. We will take your questions in the latter half, but we want to just start off with an overview, Sir Ian, of how you came to this book. What was the driving impetus for you? I mean, I think it's important, but what was the driving impetus for you to write and put together this survey of 12 leaders? And then we'll go into more specifics after we hear your overview.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. It's an absolute delight to be with you this evening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with you in the next few minutes. But what persuaded me to write this book, it was really nothing to do with the issues that you just mentioned, but either in the US, but I've written two books, extensive books on the history of Europe. Panoramic books in which each of these individuals figured to some extent, but I had the feeling at the end that I wasn't able to do justice really to the role played by these individuals, and therefore I thought I would write another book about the 20th century in Europe where the individuals took center stage, and I looked at it through that question of to what extent there were structural constraints, structural issues that determined European history, and to what extent these individuals did make their own history. Were they makers of history, or were they made by it? And in a sense, of course, it's both. So that was my motivation for writing the book in the first place.
And we have a wide selection of leaders. And for our audience who may not have the book yet, could you take us through some of your framework for choosing these 12? Some are dictators and authoritarians. Some are coming from democratically or more democratically selected societies. What was your, some of your top line when choosing these 12? And why 12? Why not 8?
Okay. Well, the number 12 was, in a way, incidental. I had two criteria, really. The first and the most important of the criteria was that each of the individuals I chose had to have shaped the history of Europe in the 20th century through some personal impact. I was looking at the impact of these individuals. So the first one was that each of them had to have had an impact on the history of Europe in the 20th century. There were many others that I thought of including, but then discarded at the end because I thought their impact probably wasn't as substantial. And the second criterion was that they had to be European leaders of either heads of government or heads of state. So I decided that it was a difficult decision in certain ways, but I decided to exclude non-Europeans from this. Most prominent of the ones that I really considered long and hard was Roosevelt, because he obviously an American president who did have a huge impact in the Second World War on Europe. But I decided in the end that then it would have opened up the question, well, why not other US presidents who also made a significant contribution? Woodrow Wilson, right through to Bill Clinton, probably, and you can pick and choose a number of them. And because of my method of approaching this book, which meant that I had to go into the preconditions of the impact of these individuals, which then took me into the prehistory in the different European countries. I thought, well, a figure like Roosevelt, I would then have to go into the prehistory in American history, which would take me really outside the European context that I was trying to deal with. And then also, of course, not just US presidents, but you could then think of others who ought to be included. What about Mao Zedong, for example, and so on. So just the overall project would have become absolutely enormous if that had been the case. Why 12 and not 8? Just because I thought each of these individuals was worthy of a place in it. It could have been 8, but a shorter book is true.
One of the things I'm very struck by, having read the book, is that you picked, as you said, leaders, heads of government, heads of state, but not just simply people who were at the helm when major events were happening, but really people who seemed to take their cognitive imprint and imprint it on the institutions, the state, party, so on and so forth. That these leaders are not people who just simply happen to be in charge when something happened, but as you said, are shapers, and perhaps not even, as I said, not even just shapers, but had a vision and were able to get others to accept it and to shape institutions to sort of carry out their vision. So I'm, in this case, thinking just simply of, Vladimir Lenin, who, is not really at the head of the Soviet state for very long, but whose imprint on, what was the Russian Empire and then becomes the Soviet Union leaves a legacy that we're still unraveling or dealing with today. And just maybe, to take from the 20th century to the 21st, do you see any signs of 21st century leaders that might be, part of a volume 2 of makers and shapers of Europe? Is it too early to tell, or just we don't have the right conditions for that type of leadership?
Just one word on the people that I chose to add on to what I said earlier, which is that a leitmotif of the book is crisis. So each of these leaders is in one way or the other a product of crisis, with the exception maybe of Helmut Kohl, who then benefits from crisis, who uses crisis to his own advantage. But to answer your question about the 21st century, we are, of course, only a quarter of the way through it. And the people that we instinctively think of important in the 21st century now, we could obviously talk about Putin, and in your own country, then evidently Trump. So these people, we can't actually deal with their full legacy because we don't know what that legacy is going to be. It's too early. So there are other people that I would have included, and these, as I've just indicated in the case of ex-President Trump, it is not a European leader. So if there were to be a volume 2, which I won't be writing incidentally, but if there were to be a volume 2, it would have to be on a global scale and not just European, a reflection of Europe's own declining position probably globally, but also the fact that major players globally are now essential components of the Europe. So apart from Putin, still we have Xi Jinping, we'd have Erdogan, and somebody in India. So it will be a global history of power, not just a Europe. And I think that's maybe the most important thing which has changed from the 20th century, that we can no longer see this as a European story, but it has to be a global story.
For our audience at home, I wanted to mention the names of who you cover. So in case anyone has questions, the 12 are Lenin, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, de Gaulle, Adenauer, Franco, Tito, Thatcher, Gorbachev, and Kohl, some of whom we've mentioned. But if our audience wants to formulate any questions, those were the 12. And the construct I found of the chapters is really interesting. And I kind of want to delve into that as we start looking at specific figures. as you mentioned, there are two parts to your look at each character: the preconditions of power, how they were able to rise, their personality. And I love how you structure the look at their leadership through the crises that they managed, but then how it changed when they were in power, and then the legacy. And I think it's really important, and for some of these characters, to mention that they were such central and important figures and had such outsized personalities at the time, but their legacy, like Tito, is dust in the wind. And I think this is the importance of the book, and in giving perspective, which sometimes I think if you're on Twitter all the time, you lack, is perspective. And certainly Tito's story is one such story that might lead us into this discussion of perspective, and how we can maybe apply some of the lessons of looking at current leaders with this idea of perspective and legacy. What were some of the legacy questions? I just love the legacy part of each chapter. What were some of the legacy kind of frameworks you looked at when you were looking at legacy?
Obviously, I was looking all the way through the book. My concern was with impact. And as you've just been indicating, some of the legacies were very long lasting, as in the case of Lenin, for example, or a legacy, not just a personal legacy, but a doctrine associated with Lenin that lasted right through till 1991. On the other hand, the case of Tito, which was an extremely short legacy. The shortness of the legacy demonstrates that figure himself, who, in a way, almost single-handedly held that fairly ramshackle system together. Within 10 years of his death, it was then plunged into war. So in each case, then, the legacy reflects the importance of the individual. To take one other example, Mussolini, we obviously have a case there of now Mussolini is, in a sense, in the news again because Giorgia Meloni, who had a neo-fascist past, has now taken over as Prime Minister of Italy. And that has brought back into the fore then what Mussolini's legacy was for Italy, and are there elements of Italian political culture which actually still pick up on Mussolini's legacy, and the notion that that seems to prevail right in Italy is that Mussolini was essentially there were good times, and he was a good dictator and didn't really do much harm and all the rest of it. If you actually look at it, actually that's a false image of what Mussolini had been like, but that image has lasted through and colored present day politics to some extent in Italy today. So in these ways, you can actually see the legacy. And maybe just one other point to make, one other legacy, that of Hitler, which where the moral legacy of Hitler is still with us today, and not just in Europe either, but more or less globally, you could see it in a sense, with the impact of anti-Semitism, with the maybe even the state of Israel, and as one part of Hitler's legacy too, and so on. And so we have, in a number of ways, then a moral legacy, which in different ways is reflected right to this day and is going on into the future. So in every one of these instances, the question of legacy is a crucial one to pose about the impact of that individual on history.
I think oftentimes readers and commentators will gravitate to what we might describe as the negative personalities that you're describing. So Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, to begin with. But there's also the question of the legacy of some of the other leaders that you have covered. And I was really struck in reading both the chapters on Charles de Gaulle and then on Margaret Thatcher, to the extent to which they so have legacies that subsequent prime ministers and presidents really operate in the shadow to some extent of, certainly of in France of de Gaulle, but the extent to which Margaret Thatcher set a legacy for Britain that continues, the arguments and the policies and the direction that she set forward really, have continued to endure. Can you talk a bit more about that type of legacy, the heirs or the successors to a legacy? As you said, Tito had no heirs. His heirs decided to destroy Yugoslavia. But we have in France and Britain, and then, of course, by extension, the European Union, and how the European Union has evolved, and how Europe itself has, in some ways, toggled between Thatcher and de Gaulle, with Adenauer and Kohl perhaps also there, but maybe a bit more on those legacies, the living legacies or the continuing legacies of some of the people that you've covered in the book.
Yes, well, it's obviously a very, very good and important question. And in the case of Charles de Gaulle, you have the most obvious part of his legacy is the fact that France still has the constitution that he created in 1958. So he actually set up a framework of government for France, which exists to this day. And everywhere you go in France, there are General de Gaulle squares, de Gaulle statues, and so on, an airport named after him. So his legacy is self-evident everywhere you travel in France and in the institutions of that country. And I think it's probably the case that his legacy now overshadows that of Napoleon, for example. So he is the individual who had the greatest impact on French history. Yet in his own lifetime, he was a divisive figure in many ways, uniting the French people, of course, in the latter stages of the war, the Second World War, but thereafter, in many ways, divisive internally within France. But his legacy is that of the great national figure, almost a unifying figure, which is a bit of a contrast to what he was in his lifetime. In the case of Thatcher, there's no question she was divisive in her lifetime and is divisive to this day. And a part of her legacy, which really took shape after her death and long after she'd left power, was as I make the case in the book, that she was the midwife of Brexit in a way. And that because of her impact on the right of the Conservative Party, she shaped then the debate, which gathered in pace until between 2012 and 2016. It became a sort of really poisonous factor in British politics, and then resulted in the referendum result, which took Britain, to my great sorrow, out of the European Union at that time. And just on the European Union for a second, two people that I didn't include in the book because they didn't fit my criteria were Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman. Both of them actually the founders of what later became the European Union, but neither of them was actually a head of state or a head of government, so they didn't figure. But there we have a collective enterprise in a way, which has become extraordinary importance in European terms, and has its own, if there were something on institutions as opposed to individuals, then the European Union would certainly have a prominent role here.
I love the legacy discussion, but one of the other parts, I'm going backwards, I suppose, because legacy was always the ending chapter part of the chapter, but that was what was fascinating to me as we look at perspective and today's leaders. What kind of legacy are they going to leave? And I'm not so sure that our leaders today think that way. But what they do think about is who they are as people on the stage. And if anybody exemplifies their need to be on the stage and to be heard in America, at least, it's Donald Trump. But I love your list of what defines the personalities in this book. So I want to read a few, and then maybe have you discuss, how you put this together. So the common threads between the leaders discussed in the book, and I think, we can see this, obviously, single-mindedness, extraordinary determination, strength of characters to surmount hardships, relentless will to succeed, driven, fulfilling destiny. When I was reading these, of course, for me, I'm thinking of Zelenksyy and the war. And we'll talk about that in a second, because I think, speaking of crises, we are in crisis. But let's stick with personality for a second. Down this list, ability to inspire, language that captures, taste for power, and then, interestingly enough, this instinctive authoritarian instinct. Ruthlessness was another word you used. I thought, wow. And even in leaders that are supposedly coming from rules-based systems and democratic institutions, this slight instinctive authoritarianism. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Certainly, we see this in a Hitler or Stalin, but it wasn't a term that I would use for, a Kohl or a Thatcher. And yet you provided some examples. I wanted to kind of dig deeper into that.
Yes, obviously, if we're talking about the dictators of the first half of the 20th century, then authoritarianism has a different ring to using that term for political leaders of the second half of the 20th century, such as Thatcher or Helmut Kohl. And yet, they did share some of these characteristics that you've mentioned, in fact, many of the characteristics, and they did have that element of they wanted not just to be part of a collective, but actually to lead that collective and to shape it. And Thatcher imprinted her own message on her own cabinets in Britain the whole way through. And you could say the same about Adenauer in Germany. Afterwards, he worked collectively, but he led that cabinet. He just wasn't the most prominent member of it. He actually led it in the direction that he wanted to go. And so I think it may well be that this authoritarian leaning, anyway, is a prerequisite of any individual who's going to make a mark on history. It can be a very negative element. In the case of, let's say, Winston Churchill in 1940, it was a very positive characteristic that there wasn't time then to go through all the democratic niceties. He had to take quick decisions. He took the decisions in May 1940, crucial decision about whether Britain should stay in the war or whether it should look for terms, first through Mussolini, secondly, unquestionably, then through Hitler. Would have been a very different outcome to the war in Europe and globally if that approach had been taken. But yet Churchill still, when that decision was being made, he led that decision. He imprinted his own mind upon it, but he did actually discuss it for 3 days with his war cabinet. Another four people, 5 people in all took that decision, but led by Churchill. And the same with Adenauer in the case of whether West Germany, as it was at the time, the Federal Republic of Germany, whether it should actually continue to look westwards, in particular to the United States, and bind itself there, or whether it should consider Stalin's offer, apparent or seeming offer anyway, in 1952, of a neutralized West Germany, or neutralized Germany, and a democratic Germany. So what these terms were meant to Stalin were different from what we understand by it, probably. But nonetheless, it was in some ways, a tempting offer. And the Social Democrat Party in Germany was actually in certain ways attracted by this offer. Adenauer himself led the decision immediately then to reject this offer from Stalin and to continue the binding of West Germany to the West and to the USA in particular. Now, it seems in retrospect that was an axiomatic decision that he would have taken. It was obvious that that's the way it would be. It wasn't so obvious at the time. It was a key decision. And Adenauer's authoritarian leanings were pushed that cabinet in the right direction at the time. But he didn't just sort of say, let's talk about this, but he gave them what he wanted to see as the outcome to that and led them very directly to it. So that's, I think, what I'm understanding by these authoritarian leanings. The goal, of course, we've spoken about already, but of all the leaders, the democratic leaders, he was the most authoritarian of all. So semi-democratic in a way, but still, the key, I think the key criterion for democratic leaders is, are they prepared to leave power peacefully when they're defeated? And that is the case, though we have one exception, of course, in your own country there, and that was the case where it didn't apply. But in the case of Churchill or Adenauer, de Gaulle, and so on, they all left office peacefully, and there was a natural transition, and that is different from any dictator.
You allude to this, and I want to talk about the people that these leaders had to work with. You refer to it as a power cartel or a charismatic community. Can you discuss that a little bit more? I really like the term.
Yes. the charismatic community is a term I've taken directly from the German sociologist Max Weber, and I use charisma all the time only in his sense, which is that it's not necessarily a set of attributes that an individual has, but they are attributes which are projected onto that individual by his surrounding, by his entourage, by what Weber called his charismatic community. And then they project onto an individual their own fears, their own wishes, their hopes, and so on. And they see in a given individual then heroic qualities, and that is then the charismatic individual figure who's seen to have charisma. And that's exactly, and of course, once these individuals then gain power, as in the case of Hitler or Mussolini and so on, then they're able, of course, to construct that charisma then artificially, manufacture it through their monopoly control of mass media. So it's not in any sense a sort of natural characteristic of someone, but it's a projection which then is massively emblazoned through the use of the monopoly mass media, monopoly control mass media. What was the other concept I used?
Power cartel.
Oh, power cartel, yes. And I tried to use that term to suggest that although we focus quite naturally on individuals, and in this book, this is a book about individuals, but the individuals are not isolated. They're not. We just talk now about this war in Ukraine as Putin's war. Everything is just totally Putin, Putin, Putin. There's no consideration ever given to what lies behind Putin. Now, I'm no expert on Putin. I don't know the answer to that question as to how strong these individuals are in the military, in the intelligence services, and so on, the oligarchs who are behind Putin. But in the cases I'm dealing with here, there is a group of individuals always in powerful positions themselves, and with the ability then to really to influence in certain ways the leader of that society. Now, at certain times, if that leader is able to stay in power for long enough, and if that leader has benefited from such a mega crisis that the structures of power, the conventional structures, have disintegrated or been corroded, then what usually happens is that individual can extend his own power over time at the expense of the individuals in the power cartel. And by power cartel, I don't mean that everybody has an equal decision-making prowess. No, because in each of these cases, the individual concerned does actually take the key decisions. And I'm sure we're seeing that with Putin now. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't substantial groupings behind these individuals who themselves play an essential role in the underpinning of that power and the exercise of that power. And if you just look for a second, of course, I use the term, I think, most explicitly in the book with regard to Franco and his long rule in Spain, where he's supported in that rule by leaders of business, by the agrarians, by the Catholic Church, as well as by the Falange Party and by the military, most of all by the military leadership. But it could apply also to others, and you've only got to think for a second about Nazi Germany and think of the importance of an organization like the SS and so on. The leader of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who then is a key element in the support for Hitler and the exercise of that power. And now that power then itself is able to become more elaborated and more extensive without Hitler necessarily having to give instructions or diktats all the time from above. So that's really what I'm talking about with the power cartel.
Just to jump in there, I think power cartel is a great concept. It does help explain the dynamics in the Kremlin because Putin is one individual, but we talk often about Kremlin clans, power groupings. He obviously can imprint some of his policy preferences, but at the same time, he's also negotiating with people who have power in their own right. So I think it is a useful concept for discussing current events. One thing that when you were talking about the charisma and the creation and the sustenance of charisma, and then you noted that with the great totalitarian dictators of the 20th century, control of media proved to be absolutely essential in doing that. And maybe, again, this is something we won't know in the 21st century, but certainly the fragmentation of media in the 21st century, the rise of social media. Just thinking, what happens if Lenin in the middle of 1917 had to monitor a Bolshevik Twitter feed with people saying, "Is it time to do the revolution yet? No, the conditions aren't great," and so on and so forth. That certainly might have had a change on history. Tatiana, I know you mentioned President Zelensky, and you just wrote for Orbis a great piece on Zelenskyy's use of new media, digital media, social media, and I don't know if that's something you wanted to, when you alluded to Zelensky before as a leader in crisis, if that was something you also wanted to bring in, but sending it back over to you for your next question.
Yeah, well, I do think that communication is certainly an important part when looking at how these leaders have dealt with the crises. And so, the way I want to frame that is looking at what we talk a lot about here at the Doorstep, which is how leaders have to respond to the everyday concerns of the population. And so, to the extent that we can maybe connect personality and power and these 12 leaders that we're looking at today to how much they dealt with domestic concerns and had to shape the will of the people, is something that I would really like to get at, and then move over to then the communications angle. So here our goal is to always look at how does the world impact your everyday decisions and everyday life. And certainly in Europe in the 20th century, it was important. The British were looking at what was happening in Germany, when they were making their decision. There were important trade ties, right? Then and now and today, so how important and how was that managed? Maybe give some examples of leaders who better managed kind of taking the doorstep concerns of the population into how they became stronger leaders.
Let me give you just one example that comes to mind straight away, taken from my long-standing research, of course, many years ago on Nazi Germany. But in 1936, Germany was facing problems internally about essentially whether financial allocation should be given to food shortages at the time or to armaments. And this was an issue which was causing, if you look at the police reports at the time, there's quite a lot of unrest in Germany about the social conditions then in 1935-36. And the unrest was feeding through, and it did feed through to the top. So the people at the top of that regime, including Hitler, were aware of what was going on down below. Now, I'm not talking about cause and effect but in March 1936, Hitler's troops crossed over and entered the demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, and it was a massive triumph. They took back that control over the demilitarized zone. It was fully incorporated into Germany. A very short time afterwards, in late March, Hitler had a plebiscite, which brought a 99% result of support for his action. Now, of course, 99% completely ridiculous, but nonetheless, you look at the reports from the underground left-wing organizations, and they all say that people on the left as well were impressed by this move. In other words, what I'm saying is that foreign policy move, then it deflated immediately the unrest which was there beforehand, and Hitler won a major triumph, which then had domestic repercussions, even on the left-wing opponents, who were then able to say, well, we don't like this regime, but Hitler, what a guy. He's pulled it off yet again. So that is a linkage then, an explicit linkage between foreign and domestic policy from one dictator. And of course, there the monopoly control of propaganda plays its part there, because there was no counter agency that which could say, well, hang on, because this is dangerous for all whatever reasons. And if we look at today's Russia, then of course we have social media, as you quite rightly point out, and social media can be a double-edged sword in terms of this. But in Russia, the control of the mass media undoubtedly is shaping much opinion there as to the support for Putin and for the war in Ukraine. Whatever the unrest is, whatever the discontent is, we can't measure that. We can't know it. And there's no way in which that can be expressed in the way it would be in the USA or in Britain. So we have to go for snippets of information about it, but accept the fact that much of the information that people are getting internally there is actually shaped by the regime itself.
I think that's true, but I think the difference and in the 21st century that we're going to find, if I might posit a hypothesis, if we were talking 100 years from now, is that access to the internet through VPNs, through virtual private networks, I think is creating connections that may not have been available if you're only listening to radio or getting flyers thrown down at you from airplanes, if we're talking World War II or World War I, or if you're doing gossip, my grandfather was a partisan in Ukraine, and they looked at trees and like shared information through gossip lines, and right. So, but today, I mean, we're getting information from Iran, right? The protests in Iran are happening. They have galvanized tremendous youth involvement here in the US. When you can think about Iran as a closed society, you're not getting much information, state controlled, and yet these access to these VPN networks that is allowing images to flow, information to flow, connections that I think aren't even understood today in 2022 that I think are going to be really important. And we see some of this already. So to go back to the Ukraine war, we see some of this already in the success of the Ukrainian military campaign is, I think, my hypothesis is very much driven by social media and the connections that have been made globally by President Zelenskyy himself. A very strong personality with all the personality traits. I'm ticking off all of your personality traits. War creating that crisis that he's responding to, right? If he didn't have the war, I don't think we'd have Zelenskyy. So what are some of your reactions or responses to some of that?
Well, first of all, I entirely agree with the point you've just been made about the use of the internet and social media as something which really is a tool to provide different messages to those which are those of the regimes in question. Of course, one thing that comes to mind still is that if you're looking at Iran, as you've just been saying, you look at the messages which are coming through from there and the unrest which is patently present in Iran, you still see the strength and the power of that regime in holding it down. It's not showing signs so far anyway of crumbling. On the question of Zelenskyy, again, fully agree. He's an amazing war leader, and of the people that I deal with in this book, the one he reminds me of in a sense is Churchill, because Churchill before 1940 had been a relative failure in political terms. And then he comes as far as the right man in the right place at the right time. And you could say of Zelenskyy too, that he wasn't exactly a massive success as a peacetime leader of Ukraine. And then this invasion takes place, and all at once, Zelenskyy is just establishing himself as a really outstanding war leader. And whatever happens afterwards, he'll always be remembered for the part that he's played in this extraordinary war that Ukraine, defensive war that Ukraine is fighting against the invaders. So in that sense too, you can see parallels. But I think the major point that you're making is actually the use of social media and of the internet, really in general, to provide an avenue which undermines dictatorships. And I agree with that. But at the same time, we can also see how, just going back to President Trump for a second, how the internet can be used and social media can be used in the opposite way to bolster the power that's already exists. And of course, it's an intriguing counterfactual. What what would these dictators have made of social media at the time and Twitter and the rest of it? How would Goebbels have operated with that? Who knows? But I think your general point is absolutely well made.
I want to just remind our audience to send in questions. Thank you to Giuseppe Mazzoni for your comment. He's really interested in your book, so Ian, so that's great. But we want other questions, other comments. I'm monitoring the chat, so please do send in your questions.
I did want to take from Giuseppe Mazzoni's comment, though, about the development and the strength of autocratic regimes. And then maybe tie it to one of the leaders. I'm really happy that you covered him, because he doesn't, I think, get a lot of attention, and we don't really see him as having relevant lessons. But going back to Francisco Franco, so often when we talk about in our modern discourse about we talk about someone being fascist, and then we immediately default to the person is the next Hitler. Giuseppe's point about Mussolini as well. But in some ways, we look at leaders like Putin, we look at potential people sort of starting to edge towards perhaps that part of the spectrum in Erdogan, Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil. It often seems that Franco is a leader we should be thinking more of in terms of coming to power, how he maintained power, how he navigated the international system. Went from being a beneficiary of Hitler and Mussolini's assistance to becoming certainly a de facto partner of the Western alliance after the war. Are there things from Franco's experience and the fact that you selected him for the book that you think that we ought to be paying more attention to, and perhaps the next time someone wants to say this person is the next Hitler, to be able to say no, but he may be the next Franco?
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I included Franco because Spain, we tend to think of this as being a little an outsider, really. It doesn't play a central part in Europe. So Franco is obviously a key figure in Spanish history, but is he a key figure in European history? Well, after all, there were 30,000 Europeans who fought in the Spanish Civil War, apart from not non-Spaniards, who fought in the Spanish Civil War. And Franco played his part in that Second World War. He also played a part in the Cold War. So in a way, there was an element there where Franco was a European figure. But going back to your central point there, yes, I think Franco is actually more typical of dictators than Hitler or Mussolini, in that sense, that Franco established power. He came to power solely through his prowess in the Civil War, as the victor in the Civil War. He was then had going back to charisma for a second, had an image built up around him, which is even more absurd than the charismatic images built up around Hitler or Mussolini. But he stayed in power then from 1939 to his death. And he stayed in power really because of, whereas Hitler and Mussolini in different ways took on the conservative establishment in their countries and challenged that through their taking their countries into world war, and in so doing ruined their countries and also really in many ways ruined the conservative elites that were able to survive in other ways, but ruined the conservative elites that had taken them to help them get to power. In Franco's case, he didn't enter the Second World War, not because he didn't want to, because Spain was too poor and too military ill-equipped to do so. But he was stayed in power because of this power cartel, his relations with the other major power groups there. He didn't challenge them in the same way that Hitler and Mussolini did. What sort of his ideology was a very limited and restrictive one, which basically meant keeping in power and building up Spain, destroying the left, of course. But then, apart from that, then he stays in power because he's not really massively ambitious in that time, other than keeping power. And that's a very different sort of dictator, and you can see that operating in other countries, in other systems, in the 21st century as well as in the 20th century. And that is in a way, a more typical form of dictatorial autocratic rule than that of the key dictators we always seize upon in the 20th century.
Sorry. Could you speak a little bit more to ideology? That was one of your categories that you looked at. Did these leaders have a strong ideology? Did they shift with the winds? And it seemed that some leaders were more willing to kind of say what they needed to say to stay in power, and which I think we may see more of today. As leaders try to get constituencies to go after them, they'll say what's current in the moment, and really just to get power, but really they don't have ideologies. How strong do you think, or was there a waning over time of the strength of ideology in keeping people in power?
No, I don't think you can generalize in that way. In the case of, say, Hitler and Mussolini, I think the ideology becomes even more pronounced, of course, over the passage of time, and the length of time that they're in power. After all, if you look at Hitler, for instance, for a second, the rise to power between 1929 and 1933, when the Nazi Party is soaring to through massive popular support to power, Hitler speaks less about the Jews than he had done in the early 1920s, when he was a relative failure. Of course, everybody knew it as an anti-Semitic party, but it wasn't so much as the anti-Semitism, which was the fore of the message then, but actually just two things. One, destroy this democracy, this system of government that we've got. And secondly, build up an entirely new type of society, the people's community. Those were the two very bare messages that Hitler was conveying over and over and over again. And the two central parts of Hitler's own ideology, the destruction of the Jews, whatever that meant different people to different times, different things to different people at different times, but destruction of the Jews, and then also the quest for living space at the expense of Eastern Europe and Russia. These two things were not at the forefront of people's minds when Hitler was coming to power. They were central to Hitler's own thinking, and across the following few years became more central, not more central to Hitler, but more central to that regime. So Hitler's own ideology conveyed itself to the regime more widely. And you could say the same about other dictators too, that is similar things happen. In general, I think we tend to underestimate the role of ideology, and we presume that people are just grabbing power for its own sake. And if we look at Putin now today, he, without ideology, I think we don't understand Putin. I just repeat, I'm no Putin expert, but it seems to me that the role of Russian nationalism is a crucial factor for Putin's thinking about his own country and about the role of Ukraine as, in his view, of part of that Russian empire, which he's seeking in a way to recreate. So I think we have to really consider what it is that's driving these individuals. That they're not just there for power for its own sake, by and large, but these makers and shapers of the 20th century were individuals for whom these ideas really mattered, and they actually utilized power to get the way to implement their ideas rather than use ideology to get to power, if I put it in that way around.
I wanted to also ask, as we're coming up to the last 10 minutes, please do send in your questions. But I would be remiss if I didn't say there are, and you address this as well, there are 11 men and 1 woman in this book. As you say, they're all white as well. And you say that is a reflection of 20th century leadership. But I do want to ask you, is it also a reflection of the fact that we didn't have universal suffrage in many of these countries? I mean, in Italy, until full suffrage wasn't available until 1945. So you don't really have huge portions of the electorate, women, young people, voting and participating and sharing their voice. And these are the two things that I see as hugely different in our 2 centuries. If we're going to separate it into a look at the centuries, that even if women did get the vote in 1918 in Germany or in the UK in 1928, but still there was this there's this feeling that you only have small portions of the electorate shaping history. And what impact do you think, or what changes, or what could have been different if you had broader participation?
Well, I think that's a very good and important point, that the restricted franchise evidently played its part in hindering women to gain their position politically. But it goes way beyond the franchise, doesn't it? That in every country, we look at the role that women played, and right down to the end of the Second World War and beyond, it was then seen as a subordinate role in many ways, and women's places in the home and all the rest of the cliches. So it really only starts to change drastically, I think, as late as the 1960s and 70s. And with the moves that, first of all, I think emanated in good measure from the United States in the late 60s, but also in other European countries as well. And the way in which those changes then gradually fed through over time meant that the role of women was seen differently in society. And incidentally, the role, of course, you mentioned that these were all white leaders that I deal with, and that's changed too dramatically, and quite rightly so. But the role of women then becomes much more extensive in every walk of life, practically, from the late 70s and 80s onwards, without ever really coming to complete equal terms. But of course, if I were writing this book about the 21st century leaders, women would figure much more obviously in it. People of color would figure much more prominently in it, and so on. So it is, and the case of Thatcher that I single out there is one almost to make the point that this was a man, politics in particular was a man's world still. And there were no figures, no people of color of significance in any European country who were making their way then to the top in politics. And Mrs. Thatcher herself, of course, used some of her feminine charms from time to time, but also was very masculine in certain respects in the way that she ran politics. And so it was changing then, but the role of gender in politics was then a reflection in part of these changes of voting and the rest of it, but in part then a wider reflection, I think, of the changes that were taking place in society itself. And those changes are making their point in the 21st century. So we are seeing a different type of leadership in certain respects in the 21st century. Just one last point on that. We did, of course, if I've been writing the book on globally rather than European wise, we did have a couple of people, Golda Meir in Israel, Indira Gandhi in India, two immediately come to mind, women who played a prominent part in politics in the 20th century, but not in Europe.
And certainly people's backgrounds were important. I think you found that there was no one trend among the leaders that you studied. You know, they came from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, which I thought was fascinating, because oftentimes, you know, you look at some, or your preconceived notion might be, your bias might be, is, oh, they're coming from wealthy families or supported by wealth. That's how they become leaders. And that's not really, in your look at the 20th century, these 20th century leaders, that's not the case. But I wonder if you did see any other trends or any other threads among the backgrounds of these leaders, things that we might be able to look for as we study, you know, the next rise or the next generation of leaders in the 21st century.
Oh, that's a very provoking question. I suppose that each of these individuals, from very different backgrounds and in very different contexts, came to adulthood and to maturity anyway, with thoughts about what was seriously wrong about their societies. And in nearly every one of the cases that I mentioned, they saw that not in the case of Helmut Kohl, I think, but in most of the other cases, they thought there were things that were seriously wrong and that they had the answer to it. And this notion of self-confidence and even egocentrism, sometimes narcissism, these are also elements of the individuals who then find their way to the top in the end, that they see something that normal people don't see, or anyway, they have a drive to put something right or change things radically that most normal people don't have. And they seek to put that into operation. And then in certain conditions, they have the potential then to come to power and then do that very thing. And I think that's the thing, rather than looking back at some psychological factor in their childhood or whatever, which takes them that way. I think those are the things which seem to me to, in each of the cases, are relatively similar. There's something or other about them that they think, this society is wrong, and I'm going to put it right.
We have, I'm just looking at the chat here. We have a question about why not Willy Brandt?
Well, that's a good question that my German friends have put to me quite frequently. So why you chosen Helmut Kohl and not Willy Brandt? Well, I just to confess, I was a fan of Willy Brandt and not a fan of Helmut Kohl at all. And Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik in the 1970s was important in the bridge to, as the question there says, the bridge between Adenauer and Kohl, but also the bridge in terms of bringing about better relations with the East Germany, but also Eastern Europe more generally. What Brandt didn't do was to bring about German unification and to radically change the nature of politics in much of Central Europe. And what Helmut Kohl was able to do, because he had a power instinct, unquestionably, he was the person who inherited that set of issues that Mikhail Gorbachev had produced there, where the conditions were then right for German unification. In those conditions, Helmut Kohl did personally do a number of things that I try and point out in the book, which then helped to bring about unification. So Brandt, if you ask me who was the superior politician or the better chancellor, I would say Willy Brandt every time. But if you ask me who was the one who achieved most, whose impact was the greater of the two, I'd say it was Helmut Kohl. And that's why I chose Helmut Kohl and not Willy Brandt.
And when we're, final question was, when we're looking at, and you mentioned it in your book, but I want you to say it in your own words, other than what I've read and repeating. You mentioned that historically significant leaders, there were only a few that top your list of these 20th century leaders. Could you kind of recap these few for our audience as we close out our conversation?
Sorry, I just didn't catch one word that you said then. The sound went. Could I?
Historical significance. You mentioned in the book, there are only a few leaders that you say are historically significant. And I want that to be our last question, because I think that's a good wrap-up question to leave us with.
Well, let me just single out two then, because I do at the very end of the book single out two. And I say in the first terrible half of the 20th century in Europe, I'd say Hitler was the most significant one. It's arguable. You could say Lenin, you could say Stalin. I'd say Hitler, because other leaders such as Stalin and Churchill were reacting to Hitler, who then, after all, was the chief author of the Second World War in Europe, the chief author of the Holocaust. And I actually say in the book, no Hitler, no Holocaust. Arguable maybe, but I stick by that. And so that would say in the two most crucial episodes for the 20th century, the Second World War and the Holocaust, Hitler was central to them. The second half of the 20th century, different in so many ways in Europe as elsewhere, I single out Gorbachev. We haven't spoken about Gorbachev, but I think he was the outstanding figure, bar none, in the second half of the 20th century. And he personally reshaped Europe. Of course, an ambivalent figure, and I try and do justice to the ambivalence, that he destroyed his own country whilst actually bringing freedom to millions of people in Central and Eastern Europe, and in other ways too, reducing the armaments race for a time, at least we thought he was going to do, and offering a more peaceful Europe. So Gorbachev was the key figure there, but we are still living with the legacy of Gorbachev, and you could say that Putin is indirectly part of that legacy of Gorbachev, that after him came the chaos of the Yeltsin years, and after Yeltsin came then the stabilizing impact, at least it was thought to be that initially, of Putin, which has led into greater crisis for Europe and brought war back to Europe, which we all thought had been done with long ago. So I think those two figures are, for me, the crucial ones in the entire of the 12.
Thank you so much, Sir Ian. This was such a wonderful conversation. It's a wonderful book, Personality and Power, Builders and Destroyers of Modern Europe. You heard snippets today, but it is worth the purchase. Go to your local bookstore, talk to us at the Doorstep podcast. We'll answer some of the questions we weren't able to get to. And thank you again so much.
I have to thank you. Thank you. It's been lovely to be with you, and I've enjoyed the conversation very much indeed. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you.